Episode 23, The Maestro. Roy Koopa crossed his arms, looking at the large pink hologram of the mushroom world floating in the center of his military planning room. Around him his key officers scurried around engaging in the sort of conversation that bored him. That was why having officers was so great, they could take care of all the boring stuff that came with waging war, while others stood around the central table with the hologram, suggested strategies. The room itself was rather dark, lit mostly by the dark pink of the hologram and of the surrounding computer screens that ringed the circular room. Roy stared at the hologram, at the small icons in the shape of his own head that represented his troops in Sector 2. Things had not been going as well as he had hoped. Although the war had begun promisingly, as soon as Bowser Jr.'s forces had arrived to offer Morton reinforcement, the battle had become much more even. While his forces were not being crushed, a long and hard battle was certainly ahead of them, one which could easily go either way. Roy tightened his fist in anger. Stupid bureaucracy. He, of all the Koopalings, had the largest army, almost as large as his father's personal forces. However, he had been forced to keep the war at a small scale by none other than that pompous, pretentious brother of his, Ludwig von Koopa. He was positive that if he had been the one giving the orders here, he'd be at the gates of Sarasaland Castle by next morning.
Roy! Great news for you!
Came an obnoxious, high-pitched voice behind him. Growling, Roy turned around to see the last person he wanted to see right now. His younger brother, Larry.
What's good news?
Roy glowered, stomping over the hard black metal floor towards the shorter Koopa.
That punk Junior's giving me a run for my money in Sector 2. Do you know what this does to my public image? Relax, big brother,
Larry said with a calm smile on his face.
You're going to like this news. I promise. Yeah, your promise means nothing, you sneak.
Roy spat.
I just had a little chat with my even bigger brother,
Larry said smugly, Roy's temper only flaring up more at the reminder of Ludwig's status.
And you know what he said?
He took a few steps closer to Roy, before snapping his fingers.
Ludwig wants you to bring in the big guns. He says we're done testing the waters and we're ready for some deep-sea diving.
Roy's eyes widened behind his sunglasses. Suddenly his temper began to give way to an almost giddy excitement.
What, you mean it, man?
Roy exclaimed.
Can I go all in? More than all in.
Larry chuckled.
I'm going to send in my fleet as well. And I think we all can guess that good old Ludwig will have more than a few tricks up his sleeve. Who cares about that?
Roy laughed, turning around and nearly smacking Larry on the face with his tail.
I don't need 'em. My boys are more than good enough for the job. Crucial!
He cried, causing a black-shelled sledge bro to run forward.
Yes, Prince Roy?
Crucial asked.
How much of our forces are fighting in Sector 2?
He asked.
25%, sir. Well.
Roy chuckled, cracking his knuckles.
You guys are about to have a field day. Send out the whole army. Yeah, that's right. Every last Goomba. Only.
His face curved in a cruel smile as he looked back at the holographic globe, which was still shining with a sinister light.
It would be a bit unfair to poor Morton and Junior if we dumped them all on them, eh? Nah, let's give Wendy, Iggy, and Lemmy a bit of fun, too. I want their capital cities burning by tomorrow.
Crucial snapped to attention.
Yes, Prince Roy,
he exclaimed loyally.
Every barrack will be emptied and every battleship will be up in the air. That's the spirit,
Roy yelled, smacking him on the head so hard it made his helmet go crooked. Then he turned around to Larry, who looked quite entertained.
"What are you looking at?"
he asked, wishing his little brother would just get out of his sight.
"Ah, nothing,"
Larry said, rolling his blue eyes.
"I just have a feeling you're going to get a whole lot of exercise pretty soon."
Organ music echoed through the blue-draped castle halls. The Koopa Troopas listened to it as they went about their patrols, shuddering as the organist hit an especially loud note. The prince was always in a mood when he played like this. Sometimes it was good, sometimes it was bad. Although most of the time, as far as the lowly minions were concerned, those two were one and the same. Ludwig von Koopa sat at the organ in the center of his music room, one of the grandest chambers in his already ornate palace. The room was hung with blue banners depicting his emblem, and its vaulted ceiling held up by gold-rimmed pillars. Compared to most castles owned by the Koopa Troop, there was a clear attempt to be classy and luxurious, as opposed to fearsome and brutal. Ludwig's fingers expertly danced around the piano keys, as the notes of his latest Koopa symphony flew through the air. He was playing the symphony fast. Far faster than he had wrote it to be played. He couldn't help it. He was in an emotional mood. Everything was going according to plan, he reflected as he precisely hit the next notes of his song. He had just given the order to start a war that would bring the Koopa Empire to its knees. Just like his father had destroyed the old world, the world of Mario, and Princess Peach, and the Mushroom Kingdom, he would destroy his father's new world, a world which was stale and still rooted in the past, one which would never move forward into his true, perfect dream of the future. Ludwig pressed down on one of the organ's pedals, carefully fitted for his large feet, as the song entered into a deeper segment. Yes, this would be violent, dark, and cause no end of grief for thousands, if not millions of people. But they would understand. Everyone did, in the end. Through their sacrifices, the Neo-Koopa Empire would rise from the ashes of the old one and create a world of pristine technology and extraordinary art, an empire that stretched to the ends of the universe. This was his destiny, what he had been born to do. Ludwig's brow furrowed as he unconsciously began to play faster. Maybe somewhere, in another reality, he didn't have to resort to such extreme methods. In a world where his father had actually been sane, maybe everything would have gone so nice and smooth even the sweetest and most innocent toad wouldn't object to it. But no. There was a problem, and that problem's name was Prince Bowser Koopa 2, or Bowser Jr., for short. Ludwig slammed his fingers down on the keys, creating a loud sound that reverberated through the whole room. Why? Why had King Bowser decided to strip his birthright from him and give it to a younger, intellectually inferior, physically weaker Koopa? From the moment he had been old enough to understand what a king was, Ludwig had dreamed of being king. Back when he had been a tiny little Koopa, small enough that even a Goomba seemed tall, he would look up at his father's huge, fancy throne and dream about when he'd be big enough to sit in it. The older he grew, the more ideas he had. Why didn't the Koopa Kingdom have a space program? Didn't everyone want to find out what lay beyond on the moon? If those shrewd aliens he learned about in school were so bad they almost destroyed the whole Mushroom Kingdom, why didn't the Koopa Kingdom have the right sort of defenses to stop an invasion like that from happening to them? And why, oh why, were the lands around Bowser's castle so rugged and dangerous? Would it really hurt to have just one highway? But no. All those dreams crushed when suddenly, out of the blue, Bowser had announced that Bowser Jr. was now the heir to the throne. Was it because he looked the most like him? Was it because he sucked up to him the most? Well, one thing was for certain. It just wasn't fair. As Ludwig's piece grew in both loudness and intensity, his fingers moving so fast and precise they began to ache, Ludwig turned his eye to the small portrait on the top of his organ. It was of a young, pretty Koopa Troopa, with a bright red shell and striking bright hair she wore in a ponytail. She was the same size and height as any average Koopa. After all, only Koopas with royal blood in their ancestry could inherit the same imposing stature and spiked shell Ludwig had. The picture was grainy and slightly yellowed, having been taken on a camera that was many years out of date. Photos of his Koopa were rare. Possession of them had become illegal in the Koopa Kingdom since before Bowser had started kidnapping Princess Peach. Ludwig had kept this picture hidden ever since he was young. Sometimes, at night, he had used to go look at it. Particularly when his father had turned down another of his genius ideas. Queen Laveria Koopa. The Koopa Kingdom's greatest secret. Ludwig didn't know that details of how his parents had met. Back when she had been alive, Laveria had always said Kamek had disapproved of the relationship owing to her being a commoner. Likely this was due to the untimely death of King Morton Koopa Sr. in the war against the Mushroom Kingdom. Kamek had had to work hard to preserve Morton's heir's right to the throne, since a good many of Morton's ambitious generals who had survived the war had tried to stake a claim, and marrying into a noble family would certainly have strengthened Bowser's power. Of course, any bad blood between Kamek and Laveria had been eventually straightened out. He clearly remembered the two drinking tea together, and the study of magic with the old Magic Koopa had been one of his mother's favorite pastimes. Ludwig's peace became slower and more somber. As he hated showing weakness in front of others, Ludwig had trained himself not to cry. Instead, he channeled his emotion into his music, conveying the feelings of his heart to the word through his piano and organ. Laveria had been a great mother, one who loved all of her children equally and encouraged them in all of their interests. Without her, the Koopa family, no, the Koopa Kingdom, wouldn't be the same. This whole Bowser Jr. thing would never have happened had she lived. She knew how to handle her husband and deal with his relative immaturity and fiery temper. But no. Out of nowhere, Ludwig von Koopa had woke up one day to be informed by a tearful Kamek that Queen Laveria's body had been discovered in the forest. She often went on morning walks back when they lived near one, very clearly dead. And while the truth had tried to be kept from the Koopalings owing to their young ages at the time, it did not take much time on Ludwig's part to discover that the cause of death was undeniably murder. Ludwig never had found out who did it. Likely it was on the orders of one of the terrorist groups that existed in the Koopa Kingdom, King Morton's old generals and their sons and subordinates who still weren't ready to accept Bowser on the throne. The majority of them were wiped out within that year in one of the most violent rages Ludwig had ever seen his father in. When revenge failed to satiate him, Bowser had quite literally tried to forget about Laveria. Every picture of her was destroyed, even the ones from the family albums, and her name was banned kingdom-wide. An entire newspaper was shut down just because it ran a respectful article paying homage to a great queen whose life had been cut short. Eventually, Bowser rediscovered his childhood crush, Princess Peach, and so began the events that would take up the entirety of Ludwig's teenage years. In time, Bowser seemed to move on, and so did the other Koopalings. Most of them were too young to remember her. But Ludwig had never forgot. He was going to make his mother proud by correcting her wayward husband's mistakes. Ludwig hit the final note of his symphony before throwing his arms back and gasping.
"Absolutely amazing, Ludwig, you've done it,"
he said to himself, wiping the sweat from his brow.
"It'll be ready for the Koopa Empire Imperial Orchestra by next week."
Ludwig felt an icy chill creep up his spine. One that he knew certainly wasn't natural.
"King Boo, come out,"
he ordered, standing up and brushing back the blue cape he was wearing. Ludwig had taken to wearing the cape a few years after the Koopa troops' global conquest. A maestro deserved to look dramatic.
"Ludwig,"
King Boo said, slowly materializing before him.
"I congratulate you on an excellent composition." "Oh, it's nothing, King Boo, absolutely nothing,"
Ludwig replied.
Why are you here? The envoy from 7 stars has arrived,
King Bu said, in his peculiar hiss of a voice.
She is making her way to the castle gates as we speak. Ah,
said Ludwig, feeling a rush of excitement.
This is quite the development.
He walked away from his organ, his cape flowing behind him. King Bu slowly followed. Ludwig left the music room and began to walk down one of the palace halls. Ludwig's palace was decorated in an antiquated style which spoke of nothing but high art. Paintings of famous musicians and scientists lined the walls, while plush blue carpet covered the floor. The walls were covered in elegant dark blue or light brown wallpaper, giving it a far classier taste than most Kupa fortresses. He glanced out of one of the tall, Gothic windows, looking down at the endless forest that spread out below the castle's mountain location, continuing on to the horizon. Most of the other Kupalings had been surprised when Ludwig had chosen the lands that would become his Sector 7. For the most part, Sector 7 only consisted of the wooded kingdom along with a few other tiny lands of little consequence, meaning that it was neither large nor wealthy. However, it had never been a decision Ludwig had regretted in the slightest. A kingdom which was so far removed from the world's affairs and so covered in uncharted forests was perfect for conducting his tests. He had weapons he was cooking up that Kupa High Command hadn't the faintest idea existed. Of course, all this couldn't have been achieved alone. He had made connections. Most obviously with Larry, since the sneaky Kupa had been his partner in crime since childhood, but also with Roy and with the organization that referred to itself as 7 Stars. 7 Stars was an organization that was shrouded in secrecy, so much in fact that he was sure the Kupa Empire's intelligence network knew very little about it. It was a criminal organization, an arms-dealing group that had its fingers in nearly every shady operation in the world. Groups like the Pianta Mafia and the Robo Gang were partially owned by 7 Stars, who controlled over a quarter of their shares. People called them the shadow government of the underworld. A group that few knew about, and even fewer dared to speak of. It had taken years of work and over 1 billion coins to form this partnership. Every inch of it was worth it. Thanks to them, he had under-the-radar access to rare materials even his father would have trouble getting his claws on. Ludwig descended down the massive grand staircase in his chandelier-lit entrance hall. 2 Kupa patrols were holding the palace's huge doors open as Ludwig strode to the entrance. Ludwig's castle was at the edge of a large ravine high up in one of the wooded kingdom's snowy mountains, spanned by a gigantic stone bridge. Snow was falling right now, although Ludwig paid no attention to the cold. The bridge had been snow-shoveled just 20 minutes earlier, to make way for the esteemed guests. At the end of the bridge Ludwig could see an aircraft which looked to him like a giant yellow helicopter with 4 rotors. There were 3 figures making their way down the bridge, their yellow outfits standing out against the white snow. Ludwig clasped his hands behind his shell and adjusted his pose. As they drew closer, Ludwig saw that his visitors consisted of 2 Kupa Trupas and 1 Magic Kupa. The Kupas were dressed in some kind of uniform that also incorporated a visor over their eyes. The Magic Kupa's golden robes were more ornate than most Magic Kupas he had seen, being longed and edged with strange, hexagonal patterns.
Yellow Star.
Ludwig spoke, addressing the Magic Kupa.
How nice to finally be able to speak with a member of the board of directors in person. The pleasure is all mine, Prince Ludwig von Kupa.
Yellow Star said, with a short bow. She looked up at the castle, studying it.
Quite the impressive structure you have here, Prince Ludwig. I see you are a Kupa of taste. Never have been anything else, Yellow Star.
Ludwig replied, turning around with a swish of his cape.
Mind I show you to your quarters? I can wait at the moment, Ludwig.
Yellow Star replied curtly.
After all, I'd like to show you one of the items we are offering and I do not want to dirty your palace. Of course.
Ludwig nodded, turning around and looking at Yellow Star curiously. This was the first time seeing her in person, although he had dealt with her subordinates before. She was old. Around Kami's age, it looked like.
As you and 7 Stars have entered into a more intimate business relationship, I will allow you to call me by my real name, Krizina Golden Wand.
Krizina announced.
I have many things I wish to discuss with you. For instance.
She smirked as her 2 guards moved out of the way. Ludwig stared at her in tense anticipation, wondering what new things she was about to offer. After all, they were partners now, not simply 2 parties buying and selling. Krizina pointed her wand at the bridge and its green tip glowed. There was a puff of magic runes and quite out of nowhere, a small, rather beat-up flying saucer appeared. There was a tiny hole in the top, far too small for Ludwig to fit in. In fact, it looked like there was so little space in the cockpit that if a toad had tried to sit in it, part of its mushroom cap would hang out like a little dome. It looked completely unremarkable to an untrained eye. But not to Ludwig. He recognized the small, unintimidating craft almost instantly.
That's Shroop technology!
He exclaimed, leaning down to examine the saucer more closely.
Krizina, you and your people have outdone themselves again.
He tapped his claw on the dented surface. Even though this tiny ship was in many ways far inferior to his own creations, even he had to admit that the Shroops had made some advances in the field of science that no one in this world had. Their lasers, for example, were far more efficient than bullet bills, and he had just been aching to get his hands on one of them.
I trust you're impressed,
said Krizina confidently.
Now, your offer of taking this inside still stands, yes? Of course, madam.
Ludwig nodded, walking back inside the palace as the 7 Stars members followed him. He motioned for the 2 patrols to pick up the Shroop UFO. As his feet once again touched the plush blue carpet, he smiled cruelly. There was a reckoning coming, and neither his father nor Bowser Jr. were prepared. They weren't kids anymore. In the past he and Junior had been able to put aside their differences and act like friends and brothers for the sake of childish mischief and defeating a common enemy. Those days were long gone. It was time to take back what was rightfully his.